also massive pros for the big brands is that element of trust in terms of the product that people are going to get, and that ties into the consistency, which can be at the detriment because they have to reduce quality to become consistent. You can't have super high standard of output and have it globally. You have to put it down to a level that's easy to manage, so it's easy to be consistent. But at the same time, it's a massive pro because any customer walking into those stores anywhere and knows what they're going to get.
Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapple Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of a 5-part series where we're talking about independent brands versus the big brands. The big brands like Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, all of those guys. And I know you guys wake up and on your way to work, if you own a cafe, you pass a Starbucks and you're thinking, how can I be more like Starbucks? Or how can I be more like any of the big coffee roasting companies? And in this specific episode, we're talking about the pros and cons of big brands, of being a big brand. So, Eren, what are your thoughts around the pros and cons? Pick whichever one you want to start at and go.
I guess the really easy one to start with, which is the most obvious, is that as a company gets bigger, they suffer from internal systems that they need to set up, and they suffer from the layers of bureaucracy, and they suffer from difficulties in communication across the company in Starbucks' case in a global capacity, 35,000 stores or whatever it is now. So that's an obvious one. One of the more subtle ones which I was thinking about recently is that their actual coffee product, they're having to roast dark. Mm-hmm. Because it produces not a better coffee, but a more consistent coffee. And one of the big challenges for a big brand is consistency, because we as consumers, we need to know that a Starbucks coffee is a Starbucks coffee, whether I'm in Japan or whether I'm in the States. So they have to just level that out massively, and they can't be looking at specialty coffee in the way that the rest of the market does. They need to get to a much more consistent point. And there's definitely a debate as to whether these big brands can be called specialty coffee, because specialty coffee is a number, as we all know. And Starbucks is specialty coffee, like in terms of the number, but it's not specialty coffee in terms of how people feel about it. So I think a big con for being a big brand is that people don't necessarily trust that depth of artisanal production when actually they could be there.
The beautiful thing about everything coffee is that it's subjective based on your perspective, right? I would argue that people who are drinking those rainbow fucking frappuccino thingies, right? That has like a shot of espresso in it. Those people will tell you this is a specialty drink. This is definitely specialty coffee, because from their perspective, this is the sunshine that they're looking for every day, right? They even think that their double macchiato that comes in a 16 or 24 ounce cup, which is like a massive amount of milk with a double espresso in it, that's what they're calling a macchiato. They would tell you that that's a specialty drink, right? Like in America, you get a coffee or you get a Starbucks. Like they now use that instead of just going to get a coffee, I'm going to go and get a Starbucks. And so for many people, because they've graduated up into a Starbucks, their impression is that is what specialty coffee is, because before they were drinking diner coffee, right? And who are we? Like the Specialty Coffee Association and everyone around it can't seem to agree on what specialty coffee means. So
I guess there's a podcast series on its own, right?
There really is a whole conversation that I had with Yanis about what's the definition of specialty coffee. And because the definition keeps evolving, we've moved so far from it's anything above an 80 on the cupping score. that now when we're talking about what specialty coffee is, it really does depend on who you talk to. Like you go to Copenhagen, and their impression of what specialty coffee is way, way different than somebody who's in New York. But the base standard of coffee in Copenhagen is way higher than anything that exists anywhere in the United States. And I don't know, I mean, what's really interesting about that is it wasn't the big brands that defined it in Copenhagen.
No, but it was, I mean, definitely it was the big brands that unlocked it in terms of a concept globally. Like it made it,
right.
So Starbucks made specialty coffee accessible to people, because at the time, specialty coffee, it was 80 or above. So as a technical kind of black and white definition, that if their coffee is like 82 or, you know, it could even be like up to high 80s, then it is specialty coffee. Whether they're then like lacing it with all manner of syrups and et cetera,
right.
The actual coffee is still specialty coffee, but I suppose the ethos and our gut feeling about, oh, that doesn't feel right. I mean, it's the equivalent of, I love my whiskey, and it's the equivalent of having a lovely, lovely whiskey and mixing it with Coke, you know.
Right.
It is still a lovely whiskey, but it's just been destroyed to a degree. But definitely a massive con for the big brands is that lack of artisanal connection between the customer and the brands. So there's the brand loyalty, which is the flip side of that, which is the pro. But for people who are wanting more from that interaction, they're wanting to kind of really get to know the maker, so to speak. They want to have that connection with where the product's coming from. People like Starbucks, they suffer a little bit with a trust element on that, and they've been working so hard to integrate with communities. They had a massive push for it around 2017, where they were doing community stores that were all designed to fit in with those local communities. But it's always felt a little bit shallow, because, you know, Starbucks comes and lands in your little town in the suburbs of wherever, and they're a community store, and it's hard to really believe that when you've also then got an independent few doors down who genuinely is a community store. So they're always going to suffer from that, but they can't have both, right? Like they've got that brand loyalty and they've got that global recognition, but they can't have that as well as that community integration. But also massive pros for the big brands is that element of trust in terms of the product that people are going to get, and that ties into the consistency, which can be at a detriment because they have to reduce quality to become consistent. You know, you can't have super high standard of output and have it globally. You have to put it down to a level that's easy to manage, so it's easy to be consistent. But at the same time, it's a massive pro because any customer walking into those stores anywhere and knows what they're going to get.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant. Available now online for you to learn at your own pace, with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50.
And so there's a huge level of trust there. If I'm somewhere that I feel it's all a bit much and I just need to get somewhere familiar, actually that place is now like a Starbucks.
It's a safe haven.
You can be feeling alienated. You can be even just as basic as like needing to know that you can go somewhere to use the loo.
Yeah.
Like when you're on holiday somewhere.
That's a bathroom for
like
all the Americans in the audience.
Sorry, yeah.
It's all okay. I constantly had to do that when I was living in the US.
Yeah. But even just on that basic level, people globally know what they're going to get when they walk into that store. And they know, they're going to get access to internet. There's toilet there. They're going to get coffee of a certain standard. They're going to get a certain level of food offering. And there's going to be an element of retail there. And that's really valuable to just have that brand awareness globally. But they've worked, hell of a hard for it.
Yeah. I want to offer another pro about these big brands. The workforce and the way that they get paid. and the benefits that the workforce gets working. Like Starbucks offer an exceptional extra package to all of their staff. You know, they get paid time off, they get university degrees paid for, they get
they've got shares as well, right?
Shares, their profit sharing, they get I personally know people who were like traumatized during a lot of the riots that happened in 2020 that ended up needing counseling and time off, and Starbucks provided all of that free of charge. They were very supportive of their staff, and they're able to do that in ways that small businesses just aren't able to afford that kind of counseling. And that's because they can afford the headcount. They can afford to employ people full time to operate within the business and then offer that. It's much more cost effective for them to have a counselor on staff in the company than to send their staff to someone that's off site. So that's a really important thing that we need to recognize, the way that they treat their staff.
Yeah. And there's also, it's also not just the way they treat their staff, it's the way they treat their suppliers, the way they treat producers as well. You know, they're in a fortunate position where they're making vast sums of money. And so in a way, I suppose the pessimist would say that they kind of have to do those things because otherwise they would be really targeted. But from an optimist side of perspective, you know, they've got the money there and they clearly have a social responsibility, and you can see them demonstrating that. You know, not 99% of their coffee is labelled as ethical. And that's brilliant. You know, there's a lot of big brand bashing, and there's not enough recognition for that type of thing that is going on.
Right. As long as we recognise the difference between the way something is labelled and what happens actually on the ground, right? Like I hear from a lot of producers that know about a lot of these buying practices that happen with many of the big brands. And the problem isn't necessarily the big brands, it's the people who are doing the certifications. And so the people who are doing the certifying are taking a payment in order to make the certification happen. So these producers have to pay for certification so that they can participate in the buying programs with companies like Starbucks. But a lot of the time the certification is being paid off. And so when some producers can't afford to participate, even though that they do operate at those standards, it's the ones who can pay off the certifiers. Like there's, you know, a significant amount of fuckery involved in a lot of these programs. So yeah. What are some of the cons of the big brands?
Okay. So there's probably people with pitchforks lining up at the end of this episode.
No. No, I mean, and again, like the thing I pride myself on with regards to our audience is that these are open-minded people who think about things. And so the reason you and I get to have such an open conversation without being feared that we're going to get cancelled or anything like that is because the audience is very open-minded. So don't be scared. No one's coming for you. Them is good people.
Well, I mean, one of the undeniable cons that people are constantly moaning about is the food, for example.
Yeah,
you know, that's
terrible.
Everyone, as soon as you mention food in a big brand coffee chain, everyone just slightly slumps, you know, and they fall into their seat. And there is that feeling of surely they can do better than that. Sure, you know, price is ridiculous, and for what you get in terms of quality. And clearly they've done the maths that you were suggesting in the last episode and worked out what they actually need to charge at to make the money. But the food offering could definitely be better. And that does vary massively by country as well. Even with a brand like Starbucks, they do try and tailor to the community, and they do a reasonable job at it. But you notice that the food offering that you'll have somewhere like Japan, for example, especially on pastry side and dessert side, is really, really good. It's amazing, actually. And I think because in Japan, maybe culturally, they have a much lower tolerance for bad quality. And that also kind of feels wrong. that we can see that someone like Starbucks can operate to that quality because there's culturally people who won't tolerate anything less.
Yeah.
And then for the people who will tolerate less, they kind of step it down. That feels quite wrong.
Well, I want to say something on that, actually. I was going to mention it in the last episode, but this is a really good time to use this as a kind of case study. When I started off in the industry was right at the time when specialty coffee was starting to become a thing. We didn't really have we weren't using the term specialty coffee yet. We just knew that there were these cafes that were serving coffee like Lavazza. And then there were cafes that were serving coffee that was locally roasted by people who really cared. And there was a difference, right? Around that time, Starbucks was trying to infiltrate Australia. And it wasn't working. They had hundreds of stores in Australia and they were all failing, and they closed them all in a day. And the reason they had to do that was because Australia, like Italy, and it was the Italian immigrants that did this, Australia had a very well-established espresso drinking culture. So we didn't need Starbucks to introduce that into the Australian market because we had already done that. The Italians who immigrated to Australia had put in the effort to create that culture. So then Starbucks shows up in Australia and we're like, this is shit, mate. Like, the quality of your food, the quality of your coffee, this is not what we accept. So they all closed everything in a day. And it was like a couple of decades before they started, and they're only just now, the last few years, starting to bring them back again. So it's just really interesting how that works, hey?
But that's also interesting because I'm going to say this really quickly and under my breath so no one hears it. But the espresso culture in Italy, for example, is historically really bad. But the quality of the coffee that they're putting out, although they had that culture in terms of people going and drinking espresso at the bar, typically it was like really dark roast, burnt coffee in terms of the way it was extracted and the way it was delivered. And they were definitely there first as a culture consuming espresso coffee. But I don't feel like they've moved at the same rate in any shape or form as the rest of the global coffee market, because they are coming out of it, but there's still a lot of places you go in Italy where you'll get that really bad, that traditional Italian.
You know, I'm going to say something.
Keeping out of this, yeah, I know.
This is where I bring up the idea of cultural palate and, subjectivity and, the way that we drink coffee is very different to the way that they drink coffee. They're the OGs. That's where it started. They've got the right not to move anywhere different from that. Like, we adapted their drink into our culture and then we took it in a different direction. And, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. And that's the beautiful thing about coffee. Here in the Middle East, this is where roasted coffee became a thing. This is where it was all born. And the way that coffee is drunk here is very, very different to the way that coffee went off and flourished and became in other places. Even the big brands here. The big brands here are trying very hard to figure out how to establish in this region. It's a fascinating market to see Starbucks operate in.
I was in Istanbul not long ago for a trade show, and actually Starbucks, it felt like they were struggling a bit to meet the demands because you've got culturally people there who are drinking Turkish coffee, which is just a completely different product, although from the same origin.
Yeah.
And in that case, it really is, should we get a coffee or should we get a Starbucks? Because they're different products.
They're completely
different products.
They go to Starbucks to drink sugary drinks. They don't go to Starbucks to drink. They drink it like because it's not an alcohol drinking culture. They go to Starbucks to be seen drinking at Starbucks, and nobody's ordering coffee at Starbucks. It's really, really fascinating. Really fascinating. Yeah. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of independent cafes. So join us for that episode, folks. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.